people drove cars back and forth there in the city of Baton Rouge. And this was at least a year or so before the incident, yeah, before Montgomery. And it ended up with the bus company in the city more or less relenting to a number of the demands because they were losing money. The people were not riding the buses.
This is in Baton Rouge?
In Baton Rouge. Now, the person who ought to have been recognized as the leader of that whole thing, the person who really had the greater respect for the black community and that sort of thing, was a Reverend Brown, a very young fellow, very good, a Martin Luther King type. He was a protege of Gardner Taylor.
Ed Brown.
Yeah.
But this was in Baton Rouge?
This was in Baton Rouge. But the person who wanted to be out front and in the forefront of things and be recognized was T.J. Jemison.
T.J. Jemison.
And T.J. Jemison, he had the big Baptist church in downtown Baton Rouge. So at the meetings, when they were trying to agree to let Ed Brown lead the group, Jemison was much as opposed to it. He thought they were disrespectful. He was head of the NAACP, and he's the one who ought to have been the leader. And he's the one who then began to negotiate with the power structure in Baton Rouge to end the boycott. And so, although they had got certain concessions, they could have done much more if it hadn't been for T.J. Jemison.
There's an article right behind you that just came out on email this morning called, how, Abernathy, basically how Abernathy slammed Martin Luther King.
He wasn't in the movie or something?
It's related to
I'll take
the
a look
movie.
at it.
Related, yeah.
But so then, about a year or so
Thank
later,
you.
about a year or so later, the Montgomery boycott started, and I heard Jemison was up on the campus at Southern, and I heard him say, yeah, he says, they've been calling me from Montgomery to know how we did this because they want to, in a sense, do the same kinds of things that we did in order to for us to have a successful bus boycott. But
Now, I got to ask a question about George Wallace. How did he end up getting the Tuskegee Award? And then how did you, why were you the person who greeted him?
welcome him as a Lewis alumnus. Well, you see, when George Wallace came back, he appointed, after he had his experience and all, change of heart or mind or whatever.
You mean after he got shot?
Yeah, after he got shot.
Almost killed?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
He had several blacks were on his staff then. And then President Peyton was negotiating with the state of Alabama to increase, not eliminate the funding that we were already getting, but to increase the funding. And George Wallace was leading that campaign for him to increase the funding by the state to Tuskegee. And as a consequence, Tuskegee's funding by the appropriation from the state increased. So when President Peyton introduced George Wallace there on this platform, he went on to say, to enumerate what Wallace had done. But then, after he said all of that, but then he said, but Governor Wallace, we aren't through with you yet. Now we want you to do this, that, and the other. So that although you've made some changes and you've helped us a lot, there are a number of things we still want you to do for us. And Wallace was sitting there, he was in a wheelchair then, he was sitting there kind of just nodding his head. And then they, of course, called him up to, rolled him up to hood him, to give him an honorary degree from Tuskegee. And this was all at Founders Day. And at Founders Day, the president of the National Alumni Association is on the program to make remarks. So time came for me to make my remarks. That's the first thing that I said, in addition to some other things. I looked over at him and said, and Governor Wallace, I am very pleased to recognize you as the newest alumnus of Tuskegee University.
Now that had to be, I mean, there had to be alumni who were like, there's no way in the world he should ever get a. What was that debate like?
You would be surprised at the alumni from Alabama who were in favor of that.
I would be surprised.
But a number that met with considerable favor for a number of the alumni right here in the state.
Why?
Well, you see, many would tell you, they says, well, there's been a fundamental change of attitude, heart, and that sort of thing.
In him, just
within him. And that he has indeed fought for additional appropriations. Because you see, when his wife became governor, she cut those appropriations.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Did his change trigger a change within the system?
No, it's changed within him. He persuaded the legislators who were in charge of the appropriations to go along with increasing the size of the appropriation for Tuskegee.
But then he died, and his wife just cut them all off.
Well, I'm trying to remember whether
or he left the office, or
when he left the office and she became president,
governor.
She cut it off, and then there was a big fight to restore it, and President Payton was able to get them restored.
So did the goodwill towards Tuskegee, did it have any effect on his wife at all?
No, not to my knowledge. I don't think it did.
Oh. Was she there? Was she there with him?
No. She was not there. No. I don't think she would have been in favor of that. No.
So she wasn't even there when he got his degree. Or
No. She wasn't there. No.
So her mindset was never changed then.
No, I don't think Lurleen's mindset was ever changed.
I didn't realize that. Maybe forgot that she become governor.
Yeah, she was. Now, it was kind of like what happened in Louisiana when Earl Long was governor of Louisiana, and this was when that was the big fight, Rain Act and all, with the big segregationists and all that sort of thing, and they were all up in arms and protesting and cutting things, anything that's supported black higher education. They were against the Nat King Cole television show was sponsored by one of the companies that made mimeograph machines or copying material, and all the stations in Louisiana cut that show out, and the state government agreed not to purchase any item from that company because of they sponsored the Nat King Cole show. Well, then they had this hearing, this big hearing in the state capitol on segregation and integration and that sort of thing. And they ranted and raved and ranted and raved. And Earl Long, of course, was governor, and he was, of course, in favor of maintaining some sort of segregation. He wasn't an integrationist, but he thought that so many of those who were so ardently opposed to integration were being hypocritical. And so they carried these hearings day and night from the state legislature on the radio, open on the radio. And I remember Earl Long was saying, says, you folk up there in North Louisiana, said, you folk are talking about how opposed you are to integration. He says, now, you opposed to integration by day, but not by night. And then he said, and I can say that because he said, my poor old uncle says, black lady her husband came home one night and he was there with her, and he shot my poor old uncle. Because of the position that Earl Long was taking, then they began to declare that he was mentally unstable, and somehow or other, they arranged to have him sent to a mental hospital. He was still governor. They arranged to have him sent to a mental hospital, and they sent him to a mental hospital over in Houston, Texas. So that's where he was. Well, of course, you see, he was still governor, but he was way over there in Texas. So what he did, he maneuvered, and his wife then took over things, Earl Long's wife. So Earl Long persuaded them to agree to transfer him to the mental hospital there in Mandeville, Louisiana. So they agreed. They transferred him to the mental hospital in Mandeville. Well, when he got there, he still was in a sense governor. He fired the director and freed himself.
That whole story sounds insane. That they could maneuver and get the governor put in a
Mental hospital out of the state.
insane asylum in some other state.
Yeah.
And then he could. That sounds just the whole thing sounds crazy.
It was.
But that's what happened.
You have to wonder, like, if they could do that in politics. I mean, Louisiana must have been just crazy state for politics.
It was.
Period.
It was. There were all
It
kinds of.
still is.
There were all kinds of corruption. People going to governors going to jail. I remember.
Governors going to jail.
Yeah.
Well, look at Illinois now. Every governor, the last 4 governors, they're all still in prison
You
in
said governors
Illinois.
going to jail, not in mental institutions. I was thinking.
Going to jail, not
Jail.
government institutions. Some of the earlier governors, they were having this big. I've forgotten who the governor was, but that they were having this hearing on, and Dr. Clark, president of Southern, told us about that, and they were having this particular hearing, and they had these people coming in to witness, to testify against them. So they had this black fellow who had been a chauffeur or something to come in to testify, and they asked him questions, and he didn't know a thing. He pretended he didn't know anything, hadn't seen anything, and then to try to trap him. And as he was about to leave the courtroom, they projected his image on the screen, and then they said, "Now, who is that?" And he said, "I believe that does look like me." But he didn't know a thing. They couldn't get anything out of him. So they wanted to try to show that he wasn't telling the truth.
Mm.
No, I don't remember. I don't remember that.
You don't remember that whole Rain Act? Oh, all day long on the radio. They were having this hearing, and the person who was the leading segregationist was a representative from North Louisiana by the name of Raynack. And he was leading the charge. They were trying to integrate schools out in New Orleans. Oh, yeah.
I remember reading that legal case of the woman who sued the state of Louisiana to keep white on her birth certificate. When she was born, they had marked her down as white, but then when she got older, she got a little, she was light skinned, but I think she got a little darker, and she checked the box for white on a driver's license or something, and then they were like, no. When she was applying for a driver's license, they were like, no, you can't do that. You're black. and they tried to change her race to black, and they took it all the way to the state level. When she sued the state of Louisiana, and her lawyers came into court and they said, well, look, you know, this woman, according to laws in like Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, if she traveled across those 5 states, her race would literally change like 6 times, just according to the laws in the different either counties or parishes. And this one she was octoroon, and this one she was white, and this one she was black, and this one she was something else, and this one she'd be breaking the law just by driving through that town, period. It's just crazy. But she sued to try and keep her. I think she lost eventually, but that's Louisiana.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You're talking about some corrupt politics from the time, really, maybe even before, but at least from the time of Huey Long.
Mm-hmm.
That movie, The Kingfish, Kingfisher, yeah, the time of Huey Long.
I guess during that time period, though, because you said that you didn't have to take that Louisiana literacy test. You had to do a birthday.
That was East Baton Rouge Parish. You see, it depended on the parish. So the different parishes had different regulations relative to being able to qualify to vote. And they were a little more enlightened, in a sense, in the East Baton Rouge Parish.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where LSU was, that's where the state capital was, and that kind of thing.
But what did you have to do in East Baton Rouge Parish?
We only had to, the main thing that you asked was your age. That was a critical question. And you had to give your age, and you had to know your age by year, by month, by week, and by day. So if you couldn't tell them how old you were in terms of so many years, so many months, so many weeks, and so many days, it wasn't up to the minute. You didn't tell time. But if you couldn't do that, you couldn't qualify to register to vote.
Was there a poll tax?
There wasn't a poll tax in Louisiana, at least in East Baton Rouge Parish. I'm not sure about the poll tax in Louisiana. I know there was no poll tax involved. There's a poll tax here and a lot of the other southern states. And one of the big problems was they made the poll tax accumulative. So if you became eligible to vote when you were 21 and you were now 35 or 40 and hadn't paid poll tax during that period of time, you had to pay poll tax for all those years.
How much could the poll tax be?
I don't know what how much the poll tax was.
Suppose you live out of state, you have to pay retroactive to.
Well, I think it depended, your poll tax was based on the time you became a citizen within the state. Or if you lived in the state when you became of age to vote.
But all of this stuff was really just them trying to say, we're going to make it harder and harder and harder. You're going to have to jump through this hoop. You're going to have to jump through another hoop. And we don't want you to vote, right?
Well, you see, this was a reaction to what happened right after the Civil War ended. When there was a Reconstruction period, everything was open. And that's when you had there was a black governor for a short period of time in Louisiana, Pinchback, Governor Pinchback. So, but you see, in order for them to gain the political power, then they began to move and adopt certain practices that began to exclude you and to make it more difficult for you. In Mississippi, Mississippi had, what was the name of the person in Mississippi? My father used to mention, who I think was the governor or senator, black senator from that state. And then they introduced the so-called grandfather clause, all of that. And all of this led to you being excluded. It didn't apply to the white citizens for the most part. Might have applied, they could have applied if they wanted to the poor white, because they didn't know any better. But it didn't really apply to them. But it applied to us. Yeah. That's why here in Tuskegee, when we were trying to get folk registered to vote, and I was a student here, that had to be endorsed by a person who owned property, first place, who had to be was already a registered voter. You had to pay the poll tax up. You were up to date on your poll tax and all of that. And if you didn't do that, then when you did go to the registrar's office in downtown, they might or might not receive you. They might give you some little thing to read or interpret and say, well, you don't qualify.
You had to be endorsed by someone who owned property.
Oh, yeah. So, and you see, there were very few of us who own property within the confines of the city limit of Tuskegee.
Right.
And you had to own some property yourself.
So you couldn't vote unless you owned property?
Yeah. You couldn't register to vote, which meant that if you didn't register to vote, you couldn't vote. As we were in Louisiana, as we talked about the move to get blacks registered, I remember President Clark used to talk about the fact that the Barker brothers, the Barker brothers, Twyla Barker and Lucius Barker, yeah, Twyla Barker and Lucius Barker, both had doctorate degrees in political science. They were from Bogalusa, the parish over there where Bogalusa was. Now, both of them had doctorate degrees in political science, both of them excellent persons. Twyla ended up as professor of political science at the University of Illinois. He left Southern finally. Twyla, his brother Lucius, ended up as professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin. Neither one of the two of them could qualify to register to vote. Neither one.
Because they couldn't.
They couldn't interpret. I don't know what all of the things were over there in Bogalusa Parish, but it was ridiculous. But whatever it was, they were judged as not being qualified to vote.
So
The Barker brothers. Yeah.
if the most educated among us can't do it, then that's one of the things I was trying to. There were some people who, when they took that Louisiana literacy test, they said, "Well, what's so hard about this? You know, this is just like logic questions and logic games and weird. I mean, there's some weird questions in here, but if you can read, then you could probably get a lot of them right." And I said, "Well, okay, let's talk about if you can read. It's 1964. Segregation." You're right, agriculture-based society. You have a lot of people who are, voting age, but some of them may not have ever even gone to school.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they did, they went to 4th or 5th grade, and then they stopped. And I mean, do you know what the literacy rates were, just in general among African Americans in Louisiana, in the Deep South in 1964? I don't know, but
It'd be low.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not blaming the people.
That's right.
Not blaming them, because the system was trying to keep them from knowing how to read.
Who was the prominent football player?
Dexter Manley.
Yeah.
Dexter
Yeah.
Manley graduated
Oklahoma State.
from Oklahoma State and was like, what, 4 years in the NFL?
Yeah.
It was like, I don't know how to read. They were like, what?
He couldn't read.
You could not read.
He said when you go to a restaurant, you just say, you know, what's your specialty? Give me a steak.
Right.
He couldn't read the menu.
And Oklahoma knew he couldn't read and gave him a degree.
They wanted to bring in the resources for a football game.
Yeah.
He was a good football player.
He was a great football
Yeah.
player.